that for the first time in human history, for the first time in all of human history, almost all of mankind is politically awake. And these new and old major powers face still yet another novel reality, in some respects unprecedented. And it is that while the lethality of their power is greater than ever, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. I once put it rather pungently, and I was flattered that the British Foreign Secretary repeated this, as follows. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people, literally. It was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control.
Greetings, my fellow freedom-loving sovereign thinkers. This is LL3's newest podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful swampy mangroves of South Florida. And today's date, Saturday, March 27th, 2017. Before I do my little rant, I'd like to wish William Crowley and Louis Amadori a happy birthday. Make sure you gentlemen have a great holiday and take care of your loved ones as well, all right? Love you guys. Yes, so I've just been informed last night that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter, has passed away at 89. I'm going to be reading articles about this man and give you my intake on him as well. The only thing I can say right now is he's considered to be a war criminal, in my view, based on the research and his rhetoric and actions. Before I proceed, I am at CJ's Java Lounge located at 400 Southwest 1st Avenue along the New River of Fort Lauderdale and in the southwest corner of the Andrews Avenue Bridge. Alright, so without further ado, let's check it out. And let's see what Bloomberg has to say about him. Zbigniew Brzezinski, security advisor to Carter, died at 89 by Lawrence Arnold, and it got updated this morning. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter, advocated a hard line toward the Soviet Union and helped develop the unsuccessful military mission to rescue American hostages in Iran, has died. He was 89. His death was announced in a tweet on Friday by his daughter, Mikia Brzezinski, co-host of the MSNBC program Morning Joe. He was known to his friends as the Big, to his grandchildren as Chief, and to his wife as the enduring love of her life, Brzezinski wrote on Instagram. Brzezinski was a respected voice of international affairs within the Democratic Party for more than 3 decades. One of his core beliefs was that the memory of the Vietnam War and has made a partly overtly reluctant to flex U.S. military might. His worldview was often compared with what of Henry Kissinger, whose work under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford gave him similar statesman stature within the Republican Party. You always knew where Zigby stood. Former President Barack Obama, one of several presidents who benefited from Brzezinski's counsel, said in an email statement, his ideas and advocacy helped shape decades of American national security policy. Policy realist. The German-born Kissinger and Polish-born Brzezinski were considered foreign policy realists with innate distrust of the Soviet Union. Unlike Kissinger, Brzezinski tried to shift the central focus of the U.S. policy away from what he called a preoccupation with the USSR and toward what he called a trilateral cooperation with North America, Western Europe, and Japan. He helped David Rockefeller, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and the Council of Foreign Relations, create the Trilateral Commission that led it from 1973 to 1976. During the Carter's presidency from 1977 to 1981, Brzezinski helped establish a U.S.-China diplomatic relations, the culmination of work begun under Nixon and Kissinger. and concluded the treaty that granted Panama control of the U.S.-built Panama Canal as of 2000. But much of his work was geared toward waging the Cold War. Sensing an emerging Soviet advantage in first-strike nuclear capability, Brzezinski played a key role in persuading Carter to approve the mobile MX missile system. He and Carter urged greater human rights and encouraged dissent in Eastern Europe. False alarm. In the early morning hours of November 9, 1979, Brzezinski was awakened by an aide reporting that the North American Aerospace Defense Command had detected a Soviet missile attack. As Brzezinski prepared to alter the president and presumably to start a high-pressure discussion of launching U.S. nuclear missiles, word came that it was a false alarm, one of the most perilous of the Cold War. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, Brzezinski pressed for the U.S. involvement. As often happened, Brzezinski clashed with Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and prevailed. The Carter administration imposed a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow, and declared it would use military force to defend its interests in the Persian Gulf. Behind the scenes, Brzezinski persuaded Carter to approve the secret army of the Afghan Mujahideen rebels, who ultimately fought the Soviets to a draw, leaving the power vacuum filled by Islamic fundamentalists who gave safe harbor to Osama bin Laden and his followers. Kindred spirit. While Vance was Carter's intellectual kindred spirit, Brzezinski appealed to the engineer president's fetish for facts. Presidential historian Douglas Brinkley wrote in the New York Times News magazine in 2002, after Vance's death, proximity to Carter and the clever accounting of the First Lady eventually led Brzezinski to be perceived as Carter's indispensable man. Vance was on vacation when, on April 11, 1980, Carter and Brzezinski convened a National Security Council meeting that resulted in a green light for an attempt at rescuing the American hostages held in Tehran. Vance's deputy, Warren Christopher, later said Brzezinski had kept him in the dark about the subject of the meeting so he couldn't alert Vance. The rescue attempt on April 25th failed spectacularly. 3 of 8 U.S. helicopters had problems forcing an order to abort from the mission's desert staging area. During preparations for a retreat, a helicopter flew into a C-130 transport plane and exploded, killing 8 U.S. servicemen. After Ronald Reagan defeated Carter in the 1980 election, Brzezinski told the New York Times that the Democratic Party was becoming excessively preoccupied with what might be called the do-gooders agenda in national affairs. He said his own attempts at military muscle had met a great deal of opposition within the administration. Power is important. It is not a popular thing to remind people that power is important, Brzezinski said, that it has to be applied, that sometimes decisions which are not fully compatible with our concept of what our world ideally ought to be like need to be taken. Carter, in his memoir, said Brzezinski was astute in his analysis, particularly knowledgeable in broad historical trends affecting the industrialized nations, and a firm believer in a strong defense for our country, and in an enhancement of freedom and democratic principles both here and abroad. His proposals were innovative and often provocative, and I agreed with them most of the time. On Saturday, Jimmy Carter said in a statement that Brzezinski was an inquisitive, innovative, and natural choice as my national security advisor. Born in Warsaw, Zbigniew Kazimierz Brzezinski was born on March 28, 1928, in Warsaw, the first of 2 sons of Trazu and Leona Brzezinski. His father, a diplomat, was assigned to France, Germany, the Soviet Ukraine, and Canada before World War II. After the war, he was thanked by the Prime Minister of Menachem Begin of Israel for helping to free Jews from Nazi concentration camps. The family lived in Montreal during and after the war, and Brzezinski finished his Catholic education there. He earned undergraduate and master's degrees from McGill University in 1949 and 1950, and a PhD in 1953 from Harvard University. He moved to Columbia University in 1960 and was a member of the U.S. State Department's Policy Planning Council from 1966 to 1968 during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. In 1976, Carter, the former Georgia governor who had bested better-known Democrats to win the presidential nomination, turned to Brzezinski for guidance when preparing to debate Ford. After his victory, he named Brzezinski his national security advisor, and Vance, who had been deputy defense secretary under Johnson, as Secretary of State. Halfway through Carter's terms, Brzezinski was under criticism by supporters of Israel, who viewed him as overly sympathetic to the Arab point of view in the Mideast policy, as well as from former supporters of detent with the Soviet Union. Addressing a civic luncheon in Fort Worth, Texas, Carter said special interest groups were trying to turn his security advisor into a foreign policy scapegoat. After the Carter presidency, Brzezinski was a professor of American foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University, Paul H. Schnitt School of Advanced International Studies, and a scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was a frequent guest on television shows, including MSNBC's Morning Joe, co-hosted by his daughter Mika. Brzezinski and his wife, sculptor Emily Bernice Brzezinski, also had two sons, Mark, who served on the National Security Council under Bill Clinton, and Ian, who served as Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Europe and NATO under George W. Bush. The world's new balance of power post-Cold War remained in central interest in his 1993 book, Out of Control, Global Turmoil on the Eve of the 21st Century. He said the geopolitical vacuum may become a dangerous world for both Russia and the U.S., especially with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Brzezinski became especially blunt in his criticism of the second President Bush in testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2007. Brzezinski called the war in Iraq a historic, strategic, and moral calamity that was undermines America's global legitimacy. A month later, he said in a Washington Post column that the Bush administration's declaration of a war on terror had served only to make it easier for the demagogic politicians to mobilize the public on behalf of the policies they want to pursue. So he's always gonna look all those tunings, but if you actually examine this article, he has this imperial fetish. If you really look at it, and this is why I question this man. Okay, and I wasn't really too keen, but when I read some of his books, including the Grand Chessboard, I despised him a lot more. So, but I'm not gonna rant on this yet. I'm just gonna continue on here, and this one here is from 21st Century Wire. And it says here, Zbigniew Brzezinski, globalist scion, dies at the age of 89. And it says here, arguably one of the most influential thinkers and authors of the 21st centuries, Brzezinski is regarded by many as a vanguard of modern globalism and the architect of the New World Order. Brzezinski's two seminal publications, Between Two Ages and The Grand Chessboard, are near blueprints of how globalization and geopolitics have progressed in the post-World War II world under an international system of the Anglo-American economic and political hegemony. Brzezinski was born in Warsaw, Poland, and attended university in both Canada and the U.S. in the mainstream politics. Brzezinski first became prominent in the early 1960s as advisor to President John F. Kennedy, and later with his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. During his tenure as Chief National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, began in 1976, Brzezinski is said to have helped to broker the Panama Canal Treaty as well as Camp David negotiations between Israeli and Egyptian leaders Moshe Begin and Anwar Sadat. He is also credited with opening up China to the West and helping to topple the Soviet Union. In his final years, Brzezinski's efforts to focus on the U.S.-EU project to encircle and isolate Russia by pulling former republics and Balkan countries under the umbrella of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or acronym NATO. So, more of imperialism, I would say, what they talked about here. So I'm going to continue on. It's going to be a short segment. So, I'm going to be doing that. And it says here, this is from the Freedom's article. Obama handler Zbigniew Brzezinski, a big-time New World Order global insider. NWO leader Brzezinski laments that in the past it was easier to control the masses than kill them, but it is now easier to kill them than to control. That's tough. Zbigniew, I'm so sorry we're harder to control now. Put the matter rather bluntly by asserting that it was now harder to control, but easier to kill 1,000,000 people. Specifically, he said that the new and old powers face an unprecedented situation. The lethality of their power is greater than ever. But sadly for the NWO globalists, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. Humanity's unconsciousness is rising. People are starting to get wise to the deception. The masses are resisting, not complying and fighting back. And that this is exactly the kind of behavior that will make it difficult for the controllers to implement their NWO agenda of a one-world government backed by a one-world currency with an army with a fully microchipped population. Brzezinski said that in earlier times it was easier to control 1,000,000 people literally than physically to kill 1,000,000 people, while today it is infinitely easier to kill 1,000,000 people than to control 1,000,000 people. To the NWO, who are heavily into eugenics and depopulation, it is no big deal to kill 1,000,000 people. Their plan as laid out in the Georgia Guidestones is to reduce the world's population to 500 million as much manageable amount. In a world full of incredible darkness and corruption, there is something to be optimistic about. We the people have become aware enough that we are starting to end our slavery and escape being controlled and mastered. May the journey towards full awareness continue. The human spirit of strength and love will ultimately prevail. But in the meantime, there's a lot of work to be done. And I agree with that person completely. Thank you there, my friend, which is Micaiah Freeman, which that's one of the things they put out. That actually came out on August 17, 2012, okay? So just to give you guys a heads up. This is some of the legacies we could say about Zbigniew Brzezinski, okay? And I'm going to do one more here. And it says here is by Stephen Ledman blog. And it goes here, hawkish, Russiaphobe Zbigniew Brzezinski passes. He served as a geopolitical counsel to Lyndon Johnson, later as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, he was Robert E. Osgood Professor of American Foreign Policy. He was a Center for Strategic and International Studies Council trustee and advisory board member. He directed Master Spotter David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission, created to address the crisis of democracy, too much of it, along with pursuing America's imperial agenda. His 1997 book titled The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives was a blueprint for advancing America's imperium. He was militantly Russiaphobic. In an earlier Washington Quarterly article titled Putin and Beyond, he said the West's strategy should not be built making things pleasant or convenient for Russia. Making Russia a partner at any cost is not what the West needs today. In 1979, he got Jimmy Carter to sign a secret directive authorizing aid for Afghanistan Mujahideen fighters, today's Taliban, combating the pro-Soviet government in Kabul, aiming to induce Moscow's military intervention, which followed what he called the Afghan trap. He later explained, saying, according to the official version of the history, the CIA aid to Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan, 24th December 1979. But the reality he secretly guarded until now is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979 that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. Interesting there, right? And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce Soviet military intervention. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Asked in hindsight after if he regretted his action, he responded saying, regret what? The secret operation was an excellent idea, and it had the effect of drawing the Russians into Afghan trap, and you want me to regret it? The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter we now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war unsupportable by the government, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally breakup of the Soviet Empire. Was most important to the history of the world, the Taliban of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe at the end of the Cold War. Supporting Afghan Mujahideen fighters was prelude to America's global war on terror, creating and supporting ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and like-minded groups, using them as an imperial foot soldiers in multiple U.S. war theaters. Brzezinski's Afghan trap began it all. What he had no regrets for led to millions of casualties in U.S. imperial war, ongoing in multiple theaters, raping and destroying countries, risking possible cataclysmic nuclear war. On May 26th, Brzezinski died at age 89. Special place in hell waits him. And I can't blame Mr. Lenman for that, because based on the past history of this man, yes, he was an imperialist, warmongering demonade. Innocent people have killed by his blood in his hand, and blood are in his hands. And I'm going to add another footnote here. It was an audio version of the book entitled The Grand Chessboard, which Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote and read by John Loth. You could definitely look it up. Just look at the Grand Chessboard in the PDF format and check out the book. But if you hear the audio version of it, and I can be very sincere, I've read this book 7 years ago. 7, 8 years ago. And I can say one thing. Since reading it, I despise this man a lot more. He is not a great American. He is not a great person. Very intelligent, yes. Strategic, of course. I'm not going to argue with that at all. But he is New World Order garbage based on his actions, and that's it. May the son of a bitch race rest in shame. And may the New World Order crumble little by little. A conscience of awareness is picking up. It's not going to happen overnight, but I guarantee you one thing. This one world order will fail miserably. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the show. Plus, feel free to download and share us throughout your social media networks. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to send me something that's interesting you may want to check out, whatever you do, please address your correspondences with decorum. You can hit me on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Breaker, iHeartRadio, Tumblr, YouTube, Freedoms Network, Scene.life, Minds.com, FutureNet.club, and Patreon.com/Loki Luck with 3 eyes. In addition, you can email me at LokiLuck3, the number 3 is all together, gmail.com, or you encrypted types, LokiLuck03 at protonmail.com. Ooh, yep, I had to do this one pretty short. So, that's all I have to say about this individual. Plain and simple. Alright, folks. Once again, thank you for your time. Plus, always remember that demoniac resistance is healthy for the soul and can liberate humanity. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading love, and may your guardian spirits be with you.